Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into what I like to call an intellectual mystery about literally one of the most famous psychological concepts of our time. It's this incredibly popular theory that has completely reshaped how millions of teachers, coaches, and corporate managers look at human potential. But as we start looking a little closer at the data, the story gets, well, it gets incredibly complex. It's layered, and frankly, it's absolutely fascinating. Let's get right into it. It's not always people who start out the smartest who end up the smartest. That classic quote from Stanford research psychologist Carol Dweck really captures the promise that hooked the entire world, doesn't it? I mean, it suggests that the ultimate secret to success isn't just natural-born genius, but rather how we actually approach learning itself. It's a super appealing idea. But does the science actually back it up? Well, let's peel back the layers. Section 1. The promise of mindsets. Okay, let's dive into this by quickly reviewing the foundational definitions that actually kicked off this whole global phenomenon. So researchers define mindsets basically as our implicit theories about whether human traits can change. On one side, we have the fixed mindset, or what's academically called entity theory. This is basically the belief that your qualities, things like intelligence or athletic ability, are unchangeable, hardwired traits. You're simply born with what you have. Contrasting that is the growth mindset, or incremental theory. Now, this is the belief that those exact same abilities can actually be developed gradually over time through effort and learning. And according to Dweck's decades of research, this one single belief shapes our behavior in some really profound ways. People with a growth mindset typically embrace challenges, right? They persist when they face setbacks, they put in way more effort, they actually change their strategies when they fail, and they love learning from others. On the flip side, someone with a fixed mindset might just avoid challenges entirely so they don't look, dumb. Looking at this list, it's honestly pretty easy to see why these highly desirable traits made the concept an absolute sensation in schools and corporate training programs all over the world. Section 2. Action over belief. Yes, but here's the catch. Does simply believing you can improve actually translate into real-world performance? Well, to answer that, we're going to look at a 2026 study published in Frontiers in Psychology. They tested this theory in physical action with over 250 Chinese university students. So the researchers had these students run an exhausting 800-meter race, and what they found was wild. Having a growth mindset belief did absolutely nothing directly for their finish times. The belief alone just wasn't enough. It only improved their athletic performance if it was channeled through perseverance of effort, which, as we know, is a key component of grit. So the mindset acted merely as a cognitive primer. It only worked when it was translated into sustained, effortful action. And there's a really fascinating nuance that this study uncovered. So grit is generally broken down into two main parts: perseverance of effort and consistency of interest. Now, in a really acute, painful task, like imagine pushing through that final 200-meter surge of an 800-meter run, momentary effort and just pushing through the physical pain mattered immensely. But consistency of interest, maintaining a long-term passion for the sport, that had basically zero impact on their race times. It turns out that in a single, grueling trial, momentary exertion completely overrides long-term passion. Now, what's really interesting about this next part is Section 3, the scientific backlash. Over 60. That is the massive scope of a meta-analysis conducted by researchers Brooke McNamara from Case Western Reserve University and Alexander Burgoyne from Georgia Tech. They meticulously examined over 60 different studies that compared the academic achievement of students who received a growth mindset intervention against control groups. Basically, they wanted to see, across the board, if the hype actually matched the reality. And while their findings were quite damning, they discovered some pretty significant flaws in the existing data. First off, study authors who had a financial incentive, like, say, those working for companies actually selling mindset interventions, were more than twice as likely to report positive effects. Actually, worse than that, they found instances where thousands of students whose scores showed zero progress were just completely discarded from the main results before publication. Let that sink in. But most importantly, when they isolated only the absolute highest quality studies, the ones that properly controlled for things like teacher expectations, the positive effect completely vanished. They found zero observable impact on academic achievement. The researchers suggested that popular press hype might have heavily skewed the early adoption of this really feel-good idea. Section 4. The deficit thinking critique. So, moving beyond just the statistical debates, there's actually a growing group of educational activists and researchers who are evaluating these concepts through a totally different sociological lens. And their critique brings us to the deepest layer of our onion here. It hinges on something called deficit thinking. This is basically defined as the assumption that a student's poor achievement is entirely due to their own personal lack of self-regulation, aptitude, or, grit, while completely ignoring any systemic or sociocultural barriers they might be facing. Critics argue that heavily focusing on grit and mindset disproportionately targets marginalized and impoverished students, basically subtly blaming them for their academic struggles by implying, hey, you just need to try harder. And this brilliantly illustrates a point made by educational researcher Paul Gorski. He points out the reality many students face through what's known as allostatic load. Now, that's just a scientific term for the physical and mental costs of chronic, relentless stressors. We're talking about marginalized students frequently dealing with less access to school nurses, heavily underfunded labs, unstable housing, larger class sizes, and literally even inoperative or dirty bathrooms. Critics of the mindset theory argue that looking at all of these massive systemic inequities and simply demanding that students show more grit is not only ineffective, but it's actively harmful. It treats a symptom while completely overlooking the source. Let's move on and see how this builds into Section 5, fixing systems or students. So this brings the whole internal versus external debate to a head within education today. Are we actually focusing our energy in the right place? Author Alfie Kohn frames this tension absolutely perfectly. He writes, "The most impressive educational activists struggle to replace a system geared to memorizing facts. Those enamored of grit look at the same status quo and ask, how can we get kids to put up with it?" Kohn really hits the nail on the head here by highlighting a critical friction point. Are we using mindset interventions to genuinely teach personal resilience, or are we just using them to demand compliance within a pretty broken environmental status quo? So, the crucial point is captured beautifully in this quote from Paul Gorski. Equity initiatives focus not on fixing marginalized people, but on fixing the conditions that marginalize people. I mean, wow, it's a really powerful summary of the sociological critique against the widespread, unquestioned adoption of grit and growth mindset programs. It challenges all of us to look beyond just the individual student and really examine the structural barriers surrounding them. Which leaves us with a pretty profound question to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. When we look at the achievement gap in our schools and our workplaces, is the true secret to success really just fixing the mindset of the individual, or is it fixing the system that surrounds them? It's a very delicate balance between encouraging personal responsibility and demanding systemic equity. Thank you so much for joining me as we unpeel the layers of this giant puzzle. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.